Meet Laura, an American who has lived in the UK for 8 years. She shared with me how to recognize when the British are saying no to you, what new words Americans have to learn after moving to the UK, and what the biggest prejudice of Brits against Americans is. I'm Max, let's dive in. Do you remember your first impressions?
First of all, I could barely understand people, which was a real shock, especially my customers who were outside of London and had quite strong regional dialects in British English. But I think the thing that was hardest for me was that I really didn't understand how people communicated, and that certain phrases and words that meant one thing to me meant something very different, and that I really needed to learn to decipher body language and intent of the communication. And I really felt like an outsider in that business for quite some time until I sort of got used to that. They got used to me. And I think the last thing I would add is that just in general in London and probably more broadly the UK, I found it really hard, even until the day I left, that people are quite closed when they first meet you. And I'm from the middle of America. People say hello to everyone. It's actually quite shocking when I go back now how friendly people are. And it was very opposite in London, and everyone's kind of heads down, no eye contact, go, go, go. I'd be in shops and they wouldn't speak to me or would barely ask if I needed any help. And I felt quite intimidated to ask for it because it just felt like I was putting them out. So I had to really get used to kind of fighting through a little bit of that closure, and then learning that once people get to know you on a personal level, then they do open and they really do care and are quite friendly and warm.
Maybe you can recall any stories like when you experienced the difficulties in communication, I don't know, with your clients or with people around you.
Like when we start a conversation with a customer, we are going to have small talk. In England, that means it will either be about the weather or probably about football or cricket. And I knew nothing about either of those sports, so I had to learn to talk about the weather a lot. And slowly I got used to that and it became very natural. I think more personally, kind of within the business as well, I learned very quickly that people don't outright say no. And so I had to start reading them where I could understand if they were enthusiastic about something or I made a suggestion and they responded quite positively, like, oh yes, that's a really good idea, then I knew they really meant it. If they said, oh, okay, I would think, oh, maybe there's a bit of hesitation, but we're going to roll with this, when actually I learned that meant, no, I don't think that's a good idea. And I jokingly started just calling out my colleagues on it. And I would say, okay, so that's a no. What would you propose instead, once they got to know me? But that was hard at first. I couldn't quite decipher what's a strong yes, what's a maybe, what's a no without being a no.
What would be the yes and no in the US?
Probably on the coasts, particularly the East Coast, it would just be an outright yes or no. Kind of Midwest and what I think some people would call, particularly in California, more like California nice. So if it's a yes, it will be a yes, amazing. There's quite a lot of enthusiasm that comes with that. If it were a no, it probably is a little bit more, yeah, I'm not quite sure about that. I don't know, or maybe we should think about something else. But it still felt, to me, it was always a little bit more direct than the British, oh, okay.
So you feel like Americans are more direct in this way?
Generally, yes. And particularly, there's just a lot more emotion in general in American culture. I think that actually turns off quite a lot of Brits and foreigners. It's like, whoa, is that even authentic, that you're so excited about something and everything's amazing? But I think I personally feel a greater sense of emotion, and I can read the emotions better because they're just a bit louder, so to speak.
I know a lot of people from a tech industry, and I see that a lot of people actually getting fired right now because of the current market. So before the work in Google, in Facebook, and this big tech was the super reliable career option, but not anymore. In the current market, you actually have to think for yourself how to make sufficient money for you and your family, and ideally, how to work remotely doing it. So I'll be doing a workshop. It's a 3-day online thing where you will learn how to generate ideas for your channel, how to find a niche for your YouTube. What's the secret of gaining first 1,000 subscribers, and the reason why there are only few channels are gaining hundreds of thousands and even millions of views, while the others are struggling to make a penny from YouTube. So I'll show you everything, all of my strategies, all of the blueprints on this 3-day event. It's free. Sign up at the link below and I'll see you there. Is there any difference in the use of language? Let's say some words that you never used back in the US, but they are really common in the UK.
There is a whole other language. Gosh, now I'm so used to both that it's almost hard for me to remember. I think some of the words that always stand out to me that get used quite a lot, and actually I needed British English lessons on to really understand the essence of the word. I could get it literally, but there's a whole emotion behind it. 3 stand out that I had to learn. One was cheeky. The next was posh. What does posh really mean? That doesn't really exist in America. And another one was this whole concept of going on a jolly. I didn't get that at all. So to go through those in more detail. So cheeky is quite a handy word. And it's very as if someone's doing something that, they're sort of taking advantage of in some way. And it can span a whole lot of different uses. It could be a little child who maybe doesn't know better, gives you that look I know I'm doing something I shouldn't be doing, mom or dad. That can be cheeky. There's a really common phrase after a night out at the pub that someone would stop on their way home and have a cheeky Nando's. So go to this fast food restaurant and pick up some food on their way home, even though it's maybe not the healthiest choice. And then, even in business, it can be a bit oh, that customer asked me for something and I said yes, but actually I probably should have said no. It's a bit cheeky of them to ask that. So I really had to learn about that. I think posh being another one. There's a real class system in Britain that still exists from many, many years ago. And that is just not something I was used to in America. It's a very different type of class and very much defined by how much money a family has. And it's very hard for families to move between classes because this concept of old money exists. And so you can tell by someone's accent and where they live and how they dress and maybe what their surname is, whether they're posh or not. So I had to learn quite a lot about that. And then the last one, this concept of a jolly, that's really just going out and doing something kind of on work time that you probably shouldn't do. During the day, well, I shouldn't say shouldn't perhaps, but during the day, we're just going to go for a little jolly to the supermarket and get snacks for the team or go walk around the block, even though I really should be in this other meeting. So I distinctly remember having the team teach me about that.
It's interesting that you mentioned this class system because my friend, he moved from Singapore to UK a year ago. And he actually mentioned that there is a class system that people don't realize, that it's kind of difficult to get into this a social circle if you are from outside. And you're oh, okay, it exists. Yeah. Yeah,
absolutely. And I felt fortunate during my time there that as a foreigner, I wasn't so subjected to that class system because there can be situations for the locals in which they just won't go somewhere or they would never be invited to a certain place because they don't kind of exist in that circle. And while I think that's true to an extent for foreigners, I think we're also sort of evaluated as person and less so about exactly where we came from or how much money we have or what school we went to. And there is still an element of that, but we are just a bit separate from that historical element of society that breeds that class system. And so I never felt as subjected to it or as kind of judged by it as an expat.
Any other cultural shocks that you experienced? I don't know, driving on the wrong side of the road or something like that?
I didn't drive in the UK much, but definitely learning to cycle on that side of the road. Other things, I think culturally understanding, this was kind of a fun one, I guess, but really understanding what a pub is and what it's meant to be and what goes on there. And they call it your local, so the pub that's in your neighborhood. And I really didn't get that when I arrived. And then the longer I was there, the more I loved it, in that truly that local pub was meant to be the gathering place. And historically, it had served as that community spot. And in one of the flats that I lived for almost half of my time in London, I lived next to a pub, and it was so cool to watch truly the neighborhood come together there. The servers got to know people, including me, and it was just such a nice, chilled place to be. And during the winter, when the weather's poor, everyone's huddled inside. And during those brief summer months, when you get some sunshine in the UK, everyone was on the terrace, and it was a way of socializing and a location of socializing that had a spirit to it that I haven't experienced anywhere else. The Brits love their holidays. And that, as an American coming from a culture where taking, a 1 week summer vacation is a luxury, and I'm being a bit, extreme in my saying that, but truly time off of work isn't valued as much. When I arrived in the UK, my very first manager said, I really recommend you take all of your 25 days of holiday, and at least 2 weeks of that should be consecutive every year to really unplug. And I was like, wow. And I realized everyone actually does that over the summer. When you say, I'm taking these 2 weeks off, no client, bats an eye. They just ask, okay, who can be backup for you? Enjoy your time, unplug. And because England is so close to so many fantastic places in the world, both in Europe and really kind of an 8-hour flight from a lot of amazing places in the world, people really do get abroad. And again, as an American, where I don't even think half of the country owns a passport, it was very cool to see that so many people really wanted to go experience other cultures. I guess the last thing, now I'm thinking of lots of things. The last thing that I would add that was a bit of an adjustment was is the drinking culture in general. Brits have a little bit of a reputation, and I think I underestimated what that meant about loving the pub and loving their drink. And it is true, when you go out, there's this concept of buying rounds. And so if you're out with 5 people, everyone buys a round of drinks for the whole group. And so you can end up being out quite late and have a lot of drinks in one night. It's almost rude to leave before the rounds are done. I am not a huge drinker, and so that was a huge adjustment when I started, especially with work, where it was like I couldn't even quite fit in unless I spent these longer nights at the pub socializing and staying out with everyone.
Speaking about pubs, there is a great thing called pub crawl. You kind of hop into several pubs during the night and drink a pint, go to the next one, drink a pint, go to the next one.
Absolutely. Yeah, one of my favorite things that one of my friends organized in the city every winter, I never made it to all of the pubs, but were the 12 pubs of Christmas. So they would pick a neighborhood in London and map out a route between 12 different pubs and then crawl their way around those all day on a Saturday in December. It was quite a long day and evening, as you can imagine, but also really fun. And that's also a fun way to see different neighborhoods. And you do feel a different vibe in a large international and diverse city like London. Depending on which neighborhood you can really feel a different vibe, and experiencing that through the pubs is pretty fun.
How do you think British generally see Americans? Are there any prejudices? Let's say when they find out that you're from the US, what's the reaction? What's the general view on Americans?
I think that's been evolving in the last, call it 5 years or so. In general, I get a lot of, oh, I love America, I love visiting, it's a beautiful country. There's a real prejudice from Brits around how emotional Americans are and how sort of loud and kind of intense that we can be. So as I was saying earlier, the Brits are a bit more reserved. They take some time to get to know, even when they're enthusiastic about something that might not come through fully in their language or their body language, versus Americans are like, you're almost overwhelmingly friendly, and they don't feel that that's necessarily authentic. I think they learn to distinguish that person to person, but in general, their view is that it must be fake.
You mentioned that the perception is changing within the last 5-8 years. What's the biggest changes, you think?
I think with what's going on politically in America, it has turned a lot of heads. And so during the Trump administration, it was, especially during COVID, I think something that I noticed was the stark contrast between, there was a lot of emotional news coming out of America and quite confusing, and one message one day and an opposing message the next day. And in contrast to that, in Britain, that concept of keep calm and carry on was persisting. COVID was a confusing time for a lot of nations, and we weren't sure what we should do, or governments weren't sure what they should do. But versus the very emotional responses in America and Britain, it was much more measured, and everyone was kind of like, okay, we'll do that, and keep their heads down and keep going and just push through the difficult times. So that was one. My experience as of late has also been, there's a lot of talk in America right now about women's rights and abortion And that is something that the Brits don't fully understand, why a government would take away those rights from its people. So I think generally speaking, both in the UK and more broadly in Europe, what America would consider conservative is like ultra conservative in Europe. In the UK, their Conservative Party is probably more like a moderate or centrist left in the US. And so there's some confusion, I would say, sometimes around where does this conservatism come from in America.
Do you think your view on your country, on the US, changed through these years? Let's say how you viewed this country when you lived there like 10 years ago and now?
Absolutely. I think I didn't have a global perspective before I left. I would try to read world news, but I still was very focused on just what was happening in my city, my state, my country. And having left the US now and having been gone for so long, I think about it much more in terms of how is America operating in this larger global landscape and how does its politics shape the world. And I care less, I suppose, because I'm not there, about specifically how it's shaping the US. I do still care about that, but I care about it in a much broader context. I just have so much more awareness around it as well. It was very difficult while I was living there. And part of this was probably just where I sought news or what I was interested in reading. But I think some of it as well is just what's readily available. And it is so American centric, what you have the most access to while you're in the States. I suppose that's roughly true of most countries, but America is so large that it can fill pages and pages and pages of a newspaper and hours of news with just domestic news, versus even in the UK, sometimes, you know, there's always global news elements to their reports because they're not A, as big of a country, and B, I guess they're a lot closer to many other countries than America is, being so close to Europe. I never focused outside of domestic news really when I was in the States.
You know, my grandma used to say, if you watched just one YouTube video, you're already a good person. But if you watch a second one straight away, you're an incredible person. So do it right now. Don't upset my grandma.